Tonight, you're going to pour a glass of wine or crack open a beer, and you won't think twice about it. It'll feel modern. It'll feel like a choice. But the real answer is far stranger. Your taste for alcohol isn't a habit you picked up. It's a signal buried in your DNA, written millions of years before the first human ever built a fire. You didn't invent drinking. You inherited it. Long before humans existed, your ancestors were primates living in the trees. Fruit was everywhere. But fruit rots. And when fruit rots, sugar turns into alcohol. Wild yeast does that work automatically, breaking down sugar into ethanol as part of natural fermentation. So the forest floor and the branches above it were quietly soaked in trace amounts of alcohol every single day. Most animals avoid this. The smell of fermentation usually means decay, spoilage, poison. But something different happened in the primate line that led to you. Around 10 million years ago, a tiny genetic mutation appeared. One single change in a gene called ADH4. That gene controls an enzyme in your stomach and throat that breaks down alcohol. Before the mutation, your ancestors could only process alcohol slowly, weakly, the way most animals do today. After it, they could break it down 40 times faster. 40 times. That's not a small upgrade. That's a complete rewrite of your biology's relationship with alcohol. Biologist Matthew Kerrigan and his research team traced this exact mutation by reconstructing ancient versions of the ADH4 gene in a lab, essentially resurrecting a 10-million-year-old enzyme to test how it worked. They didn't guess. They rebuilt the actual protein, ancestor by ancestor, and watched how efficiently each version broke down ethanol. The jump they found wasn't gradual. It was sudden, almost like flipping a switch, concentrated in a single branch of the primate family tree. What they found reshaped how scientists think about human origins. The mutation appeared right around the time your ancestors came down from the trees and started spending more time on the forest floor, where fallen, overripe, fermenting fruit was common. Suddenly, alcohol tolerance wasn't a liability. It was an advantage. It meant your ancestors could eat fruit that other animals rejected. It meant a food source that used to be off-limits was now fair game. Picture the scene for a moment. A forest floor scattered with fruit too soft, too brown, too fragrant for most animals to bother with. To a chimpanzee without the mutation, that fruit is close to useless, maybe even dangerous, since a strong alcoholic hit on an unprepared body causes nausea, disorientation, poor coordination. Poor coordination on a forest floor full of predators is a death sentence. But to your ancestor, the one carrying this new version of ADH4, that same fruit was suddenly safe, digestible, valuable. While other animals turned away from the smell of fermentation, your ancestors leaned in. Think about what that means. Long before humans existed, before language, before fire, before tools, your body already knew what to do with alcohol. It wasn't taught. It was built in. This idea has a name. Biologist Robert Dudley calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis. His theory is simple, but it changes everything. He argues that the reason humans today are drawn to the smell and taste of alcohol isn't cultural. It's ancestral. Fermented fruit was often more available, more calorie-dense, and easier to smell from a distance than fresh, unripe fruit. An ape that could detect and tolerate that faint alcoholic scent had an edge. It could find food faster. It could eat more of it without getting sick. Over millions of years, that edge became instinct. So when you feel a small pull toward the smell of a warm bakery or the scent of ripe, almost too ripe fruit, or yes, the smell of a fresh drink, you're not imagining a craving from nowhere. You're feeling an echo. A signal that once meant food, meant survival, meant calories your body desperately needed. Dudley has pointed out something else that ties this all together. Modern human drinking behavior, the appeal of a cold beer after a long day, the way a glass of wine seems to make a meal feel complete, the strange comfort of a shared bottle passed between friends, mirrors the same triggers that would have drawn a hungry primate toward a patch of fermenting fruit. Smell first, then taste. Then a small, pleasant physiological lift. You're not overriding your biology when you reach for a drink. You're following a script written into you long before you existed as a species. And this isn't only a human story either. Researchers studying wild animals have documented other species seeking out fermented fruit on purpose. Elephants have been observed lingering near fallen marula fruit as it ferments. Certain primates in the wild show clear preference for overripe, alcohol-laced fruit over fresh fruit sitting right next to it. None of these animals learned this behavior from culture, from parents, from imitation. It runs deeper than that. It's written into biology across multiple species that evolved in fruit-rich environments, humans included. But here's where it gets stranger. That mutation only explains why your body can handle alcohol. It doesn't explain why humans started making it on purpose. For that, you have to fast forward millions of years, past the first stone tools, past the first fires, all the way to the beginning of settled human life. And this is where the story takes its first real twist. For a long time, the assumption was straightforward. Humans learned to farm. Farming gave people surplus grain. Surplus grain eventually turned into bread. And somewhere along the way, almost by accident, some of that grain got wet, fermented, and became beer. Bread first, alcohol second. That was the story for a long time. But archaeologist Patrick McGovern, who has spent decades analyzing residue on ancient pottery, found something that didn't fit that timeline. Working with chemical traces scraped from jars found at sites in China and the Near East, McGovern identified fermented beverages that were older than anyone expected. Some of the earliest chemical evidence of intentional fermentation dates back roughly 9,000 years, found on pottery shards in the village of Jiahu in China, containing residue of a mixed drink made from rice, honey, and fruit. 9,000 years ago, before written language, before cities, before most of what you'd call civilization, McGovern didn't stop at Jiahu. Over the course of his career, he analyzed pottery from sites across the ancient world, extracting and identifying chemical fingerprints left behind by long-evaporated liquids. In Iran, he found jars containing residue consistent with wine, dating back roughly 7,000 years. In Turkey, he traced fermented beverages made from grapes and possibly resin, used as a kind of preservative. Each discovery pushed the timeline further back, and each one told the same underlying story. Wherever humans settled, fermentation appeared almost immediately afterward. Not centuries later. Almost immediately. This raised an uncomfortable question. What if alcohol wasn't a lucky byproduct of farming? What if it was one of the reasons farming happened in the first place? Anthropologist Solomon Katz proposed exactly that. His theory, sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis, suggests that early humans may have started deliberately cultivating grain not primarily to bake it into bread, but to brew it into something fermented. Beer, in its earliest crude form, was calorie-rich. It was safer to drink than untreated water in many settlements, since the fermentation process killed off harmful bacteria. And it likely carried something else too. A mild, shared, communal buzz. Pause on that for a second. If Katz is right, one of the very first reasons humans decided to stop wandering and start settling down, planting seeds, watching over fields, building permanent homes, might have been to keep a steady supply of a fermented drink close by. Not survival alone. Not just food. Pleasure. Ritual. Connection. That reframes the entire foundation of civilization. Agriculture didn't just feed bodies. It may have fed something more social, more emotional, more human. Skeptics of Katz's theory point out that grain domestication likely served multiple purposes at once: bread, porridge, beer, all competing and overlapping goals rather than one single motive. That's probably true. Early humans were not choosing between bread and beer the way you might choose between two items on a menu. But even in that more complicated picture, one thing holds. Fermentation wasn't a late addition to farming. It was there from close to the beginning, tangled up in the earliest decisions about which grains to grow, which fields to tend, which harvest to protect. And once humans had it, they didn't keep it quiet. They built rituals around it almost immediately. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't a luxury item. It was a basic ration given to workers as part of their daily pay. Records show it was distributed almost like a form of currency, tied directly to labor. In ancient Egypt, beer had spiritual weight. It appeared in offerings to the dead, poured out for gods, included in tomb inventories meant to sustain a person in the afterlife. In parts of ancient China, fermented rice wine was used in ceremonies honoring ancestors, treated as a bridge between the living and the dead. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, the same pattern kept appearing. Alcohol wasn't just something people drank alone. It became something people drank together at funerals, at weddings, at harvests, at the start of wars and the end of them. Move further out, and the pattern holds even in places with no contact whatsoever with the ancient Near East. In ancient Andean societies, corn was fermented into a drink called chicha, brewed for ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles and community gatherings. In parts of ancient Africa, sorghum and millet were fermented into beers consumed communally during rites of passage. In feudal Japan, rice wine carried deep ceremonial weight in Shinto rituals, poured out as an offering before it was ever poured into a cup for drinking. None of these societies borrowed the idea from one another. They arrived at it independently again and again, as though fermentation were less an invention and more a discovery waiting to happen wherever grain, fruit, or honey met water and time. Why would something so simple, fermented grain, fermented fruit, fermented honey, become sacred across so many unrelated civilizations at once? Because of what it does to the human brain. In small amounts, alcohol lowers inhibition. It quiets the parts of your mind responsible for social anxiety and self-monitoring. For early humans living in tight interdependent groups, where trust and cooperation could mean the difference between survival and starvation, anything that made people feel safer opening up around each other had enormous value. A shared drink wasn't just a treat. It was a tool. It softened the sharp edges between strangers. It made alliances easier to form. It turned wary neighbors into something closer to family, at least for the length of a shared cup. This is where the ancient story and your modern life quietly fold into each other. You already know the feeling. The slight loosening in your shoulders after the first sip at a party. The easier conversation. The jokes that land a little better. The stranger who suddenly feels less like a stranger. You call it having a drink to relax. Your ancestors 10,000 years ago might have called it something closer to survival strategy. Some researchers studying group behavior have suggested a term for this effect, social lubrication. It sounds modern, almost clinical, but the function behind it is ancient. In small hunter-gatherer bands and early farming villages alike, survival depended on cooperation between people who weren't necessarily related by blood. Trust had to be built quickly and rebuilt often. A substance that reliably lowered defensiveness, that made people more willing to laugh together, negotiate together, forgive a grudge together, would have offered a real advantage to any group that used it wisely. Communities that could bond faster could also coordinate faster, defend territory more effectively, and recover from conflict with less lasting damage. In that light, the first shared cup of fermented grain wasn't just refreshment. It was a piece of social technology, as important in its own way as the earliest tools and the earliest language. Of course, the story isn't only about connection. It's also about excess, and that part of the story is just as old. Wherever archaeologists find evidence of fermented drinks, they also find evidence of overindulgence. Ancient Egyptian texts describe festivals dedicated to intoxication, some connected to the goddess Hathor, where the goal wasn't a polite sip but complete, ritualized drunkenness. Ancient Chinese dynastic records include warnings from rulers about the dangers of excessive drinking among officials. Even early Mesopotamian tablets contain complaints about workers who drank too much of their beer ration before finishing their shifts. In other words, the same tension you might feel today. One drink helps you unwind, but a few too many tip into something regretful isn't new. It's ancient. Your ancestors were negotiating that exact same line, cup by cup, thousands of years before anyone had a word for hangover. Some societies tried to build guardrails around it early on. Ancient Chinese bronze vessels used specifically for ritual drinking were often smaller and more controlled than everyday cups, a subtle design choice that limited how much could be consumed at once during ceremonies. Babylonian records include some of the earliest known regulations on tavern behavior, rules about pricing, about serving, about conduct. Humans weren't just discovering the pleasure of alcohol. They were, almost from the start, trying to figure out how to live alongside it responsibly. That balancing act, pleasure on one side, control on the other, is not a modern invention either. It's part of the same inheritance. So when did ancient humans actually start drinking alcohol? The honest answer works on two timelines at once. Biologically, the story starts around 10 million years ago, when a single genetic mutation gave your primate ancestors the ability to metabolize alcohol far more efficiently, turning fermenting fruit from a hazard into a resource. Culturally, the intentional making of alcohol, brewing it, storing it, sharing it in ritual, stretches back at least 9,000 years, tangled up with the very origins of farming and settled life. Put those two timelines together, and a strange truth emerges. Long before anyone chose to drink, your body was already built for it. And long before written history, your ancestors had already decided that drinking wasn't just tolerable. It was worth building rituals around, worth planting fields for, worth setting aside grain for even when food was scarce. Consider how much had to happen in between. A genetic mutation, invisible, silent, carried forward across hundreds of thousands of generations by primates who never knew it was there. Millions of years of forest life, where the smell of fermentation quietly became associated with opportunity instead of danger. Then, in a comparatively tiny sliver of time, the shift to farming, to permanent settlements, to grain stored in jars instead of eaten immediately off the stalk. And almost the instant that grain sat still long enough to ferment, humans noticed. Humans kept doing it on purpose. Two separate stories, one written in biology over millions of years, the other written in culture over thousands, converging on the exact same behavior you're about to repeat tonight without a second thought. That's not a footnote in human history. That's close to a foundation of it. It also explains why alcohol has never quite settled into one single meaning across human history. It has been medicine used to clean wounds and ease pain before modern anesthesia existed. It has been currency, handed out as wages in ancient Mesopotamia. It has been sacred, poured onto altars and into graves as an offering meant for gods and ancestors. It has been dangerous, blamed for violence, addiction, and ruin in nearly every era that produced it. No other substance in human history seems to carry quite that same range, from the holiest rituals to the darkest personal struggles, often within the very same culture, sometimes within the very same family. That range exists because the pull toward alcohol was never purely cultural to begin with. It sits on top of something older, something biological, something that was already active in your ancestors' bodies long before anyone had the language to explain what they were feeling or why. Culture didn't create the craving. Culture found the craving already waiting and spent thousands of years deciding what to do with it, building rules, rituals, celebrations, and warnings around a pull that was never fully within anyone's control to begin with. So the next time you pour that glass or crack open that can, notice what's actually happening underneath the surface. You're not performing some casual modern habit invented by advertising or convenience. You're activating a 10-million-year-old enzyme built specifically for this. You're participating in a ritual older than most religions, older than most languages, older than the wheel. You didn't invent drinking. You inherited it.